Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world, around the country, around the state, around the city. Welcome to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Theresa J, and I welcome you to learn more about my experience and information that should help you give an understanding of what was taking place in the 1960s and how we dealt with it then and what's happening now. So we're going to bring it from that point and beyond. So today's topic relates to parents. Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about parents and their role in that process, the desegregation process. And in particular, I want to talk about parents in general in terms of their involvement in early childhood education. So first of all, public schools during the 1960s and beyond, parent involvement was very different in the neighborhood in which I lived. Okay. But overall, let me give you the overall information about parent involvement. Parent involvement is a clear indicator for early school success, meaning if a parent is involved in a child's education early on, then that child can be more successful moving forward, not just in the educational system, but in life in general. So this has been supported by several researchers, even myself, in terms of my study on early childhood education and parents' perception of schools. So I'm thinking early educational success is a result of teachers, parents, and young children participating in the early childhood educational settings, not just in the home, but also in these settings. So if you have parents who are involved in the schools, or not just involved, but just who have a relationship and connection to the schools, not just, staying at home and not being connected, not knowing what's going on in the schools. But if parents are involved in the 1960s, I know for a fact, it was different than it is now, and for a variety of reasons. And we can all understand that. Of course, things change. But in terms of parent involvement, most likely and most often, it's the mother in most roles, even in Black and Brown communities, it's still typically the mother who's involved. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about, what that was like and what that could have been, and some of the things that were challenges and some of the experiences that I had personally dealing with parents. So usually, like I said before, it's the mother who's involved with the child's education. And I'll give you some examples from my PS6 sisters who attended PS6 with me. Well, I know in my case, it was my mother, but in some cases, it was the father's relationship with the school that took place. Let me just go back to my original public school, PS 157, where I attended school from kindergarten to first, second, and third grade. At PS 157, they used to have a parents' night when parents would come to school and find out what the teachers, say about the students, how the students doing in class, so forth and so on. And I had to be at night because if most parents in Harlem worked, they worked during the day, which means they could not take off like some parents could take off depending on what your profession is and come to school and meet with the teacher. So it was usually nights that parents attended parent-teacher conferences. My parents participated, because there were two of us in the public school, my older sister and myself. So I think they would split up in terms of one parent would go to one teacher and the other parent would go to the other teacher. So you wouldn't be there all night because you had to wait behind other teachers in terms of who was next and what parent was next. So I know mostly my mother, but I think that my father did attend because they're, between my sister and I, they had to cover both grounds and not be there all night. But for PS6, which was 4th, 5th, and 6th grade attendance, it was mainly my mother. There's no question about it. My mother was the person who attended the parent conference. And I don't even recall how often that took place, but I just think that maybe, I think my father may have attended like maybe a concert if he were available to attend. But in terms of the parent communication with the school for PS6, it was definitely just my mother. All right, now let me go back to what took place, I believe, before PS6. As you all know, in my book, I talk about the story about attending PS 157 and going to PS6. And I have to tell you, don't ask me why I never asked my mother, but I never asked her how she was approached, how did I end up, being considered for PS6, who contacted her. I guess I just didn't think about it at the time. Um, but I suspect it was my mother. There's no question, because she was adamant about, getting a good education. There's no question about that. So, so I'm just saying, so if my mother was in contact with the schools, and I guess that's what made the difference in me being able to get to PS6, and also who was involved in my schooling, even at 157. Now, during this era, Black teachers would sometimes visit the home. And then many of them even lived in neighborhoods because they were Black people. And of course, we had segregated housing. So they, even with them being a teacher, it would necessarily preclude them necessarily from living in an area that may have been outside of Harlem. And mind you, during that era, Harlem didn't just have, quote unquote, people who were low income. At that point, there were professionals in Harlem who lived in Harlem because of the segregated housing patterns that took place. So you had physicians, you had teachers, you had attorneys, you had lawyers, you had all types of professions who lived in Harlem during that era. And so therefore, it wasn't like just people's perception of Harlem is like, oh, this downtrodden situation. It was only after things, opened up and that allowed Black people to leave, to leave New York City and go outside of Harlem. That's when they chose to leave. And that's what changed the economic situation in Harlem, became unstable. And of course, when you have a population that's completely depleted of people who have other resources, it impacts everyone who's left. So that's really what happens. So anyway, like I said, I learned quite a bit about the family dynamics as a result of relationship that was built between parents and teachers. And even my own research, it supports that. So of course, that was my mother. Now, in the case, and in other cases, the father, as I mentioned before, was the person mostly interacted with the school. And this was the case for two girls in the book, because they were sisters and their father was definitely the prominent person who was involved in their education and so forth. Because I remember him, attending events and, catching the bus, and, he was down there to some of the activities. So I remember that specifically. I happen to know both of these girls personally because I visited their home. I knew their parents growing up from PS 157. So of course, when we went to PS6, it was a continuum of our relationship. So, and they were, their father was very active, involved in anything, not just the education, but also the plays and so forth that took place. Okay. The 60s into the 70s, it was pretty still similar about parents' interaction with schools. But then again, as I mentioned to you before, many people started leaving Harlem and going outside to other areas. And so the same emphasis, so you didn't have all the professional Blacks still living in Harlem in the same number that you did in maybe in the early 60s and late 50s. So at that time, things were changing, and many, parents didn't have the time or energy to actually be that actively involved in their child's education. It's unfortunate, but they were just trying to make ends meet, so it was very difficult. So, as I said before, that had to do with the changing community. In the late 1960s, early 70s, really in the 70s specifically, drugs became more of an issue, and it was an influx of drugs in Harlem, and that in itself says a lot about what you can do. And basically, mostly the middle class, many of the middle class people left the major Harlem areas because they were able to go move out and move to different parts of the city and upstate up in Westchester County and so forth. And so it changed the dynamics that were left in Harlem community. So that, of course, impacts the community schools as to who's left in the community schools. So you have students in the schools whose parents were just making ends meet. So the emphasis wasn't necessarily the same as it was when they had more middle-class parents who lived in the Harlem community at the schools. So they pretty much kind of eliminated some of the, I think if they decreased, if they didn't eliminate, because I ended up leaving the Harlem community after the third grade, so I don't really know what it was like for the Harlem community schools at that point, because I no longer attended a school in Harlem after the third grade. But I believe what happened is that the emphasis wasn't the same, and many people didn't show up. And plus, the neighborhood's becoming challenging. So many of the teachers didn't want to be there after dark or at night in the schools. So because it wasn't necessarily a safe environment, and not everyone lived in the community. So they weren't familiar. Those teachers who did not live in the school district, they definitely didn't want to come back in the city at night. So that was a change. So that was it was not a good thing for parent involvement to be involved in your child's education if you could get to the school, because oftentimes it wasn't necessarily a priority, because even parents wouldn't want to come out because of what was happening in the communities at that stage. So that's just giving you some idea of what was taking place during that era. Okay. So despite all of this is happening, the more stresses on the family and so forth and so on, and there was less and less connection to the community and neighborhood schools as a result. And this happened like in the 70s, give or take. Still, parents still want, I believe, the best for their child. And this was exemplified by the experience that I had as a substitute teacher in Harlem Public School. And this occurred like in the 1980s, give or take. Let me just say some of this, though. You have to think about the fact that, much changes, a lot of stuff happens and changes when the communities change. And I witnessed that because I lived in the Harlem community. In fact, I lived in the Harlem community and for years. So I watched and I witnessed the deterioration, and much of it had to do not necessarily with, it had to do with economics. And we'll talk about that subject at another time. But economics played a major role in terms of what happened to the Harlem community. And then, of course, that impacted the schools and the children who attended those schools and the parents who lived in that community. So that changed the dynamics of parents' involvement, I believe, in education at the time. So with the desegregation piece, or in the early 60s, I think that was a different situation as opposed to what took place after that. And I said to before, much of it had to do with the economic changes. Parents were leaving the city and leaving Harlem, so their children those parents weren't there. So you had the middle class mostly moving away or moving out from the Harlem community. Not that they didn't go to other communities, the part of the city, which are other boroughs, maybe Queens, Bronx, Brooklyn, or Queens, and they still end up going to predominantly Black communities schools, but the economics of those schools may have been very similar with them who actually left. Because I know there's certain sections of Queens that occurred in certain sections of Queens, New York, where middle class Blacks actually went to certain communities and their children attended schools in those certain communities. So there was that same sense of probably commitment to excellence and expectation for the teachers that they had for teachers who were going to be there, right? So now, let me just share with you, and you think that would be the end of it and that would be it. No, I still believe, based upon my research, that parents still want the best for their child. Even if they don't know the history of what happened before they came, if they don't speak the language, they don't know the ins and outs of the political stuff that takes place in public schools or any of that, or they weren't involved in PTA or any of that. I still believe, based upon my research, that parents want the best for their child. And early childhood education, if you have that foundation of early childhood education, you're more likely to succeed. And that's what research has shown, all right? That early school success makes a difference in the terms of a clear indicator. And parents' involvement also is a clear indicator of a child's success. So early educational success is a result of teachers, parents, and young children participating in the early childhood educational settings, not just separate from it, but as part of being involved in the school settings. So let me just now move on to a topic that I think I want to share with you from my other experience. Okay, the neighborhood, some Harlem neighborhoods, demographics were changing. There's no question about it. The increase with the numbers of families from the Dominican Republic, and along with the strong presence of Puerto Rican families in the community, was evident in certain parts of Harlem at this point, and other parts going north of Harlem. But this is an example of what took place. Now, when I was working on my doctorate, I believe, at the time, and I decided to do some substitute teaching because I'm licensed as a teacher, and so I decided, okay, let me make a substitute teaching, sub a couple of days and whatever, just to, keep myself going income because I needed some income while I was in graduate school. It wasn't like, I had a full scholarship for graduate school. Um, I was I was able to try to get these substitute positions. So I was licensed in New York. See, when I grew up, you had to do everything. You had to get everything you could get. That's what I learned growing up. You had to get everything you can get while you could get it. And that was the way in which I perceived my life then and even now. So I was licensed as a New York, I was a licensed, I had a permanent license in New York State for nursery, kindergarten 1 through 6. And then I also had to apply. New York City had another test you had to take I guess when I graduated. And I did take it. I think it was a common branch test for license. So I was able to take that and pass that. So not just you have to pass the test, not just get certified to be a teacher in a certain grade. You had to also pass the New York City test. And Teresa's going to pass the test. So I passed that test as well. So I was also um, uh, able to get the license as a New York City common branch, I think it was called teacher, for nursery, kindergarten 1 through 6. I believe that's what it was. So what I decided to do, I decided to do some substitute teaching. And because I had all those tests taken, I was certified for everything, I was able to be certified and do all that. I was able to sub. So I decided to teach. They would call you from different schools, but I was offered in a short term, not long, it was a short term substitute position in one of the local schools that was getting a larger growth of Dominican parents and families coming in. So in this particular school, I was asked to take over a second grade class, and that's early childhood, second grade, early childhood. So I was asked to take over a second grade class from, I think it was over like maybe little over a month. I think it wasn't more than 2 months. I'm pretty sure it started like maybe beginning of November and all the way to the end of December. And the teacher was going on a long vacation and really needed the time off. So I agreed to take on the short term, it's a short term subs position and teach the second grade. So as I mentioned to you earlier, that there was a large influx of Dominican parents, families, and their children, as well as that neighborhood still had a pretty significant number of families from Puerto Rico, who had migrated from Puerto Rico. And I'm teaching a second grade, and the first thing I noticed is that, apparently there was a special rule. Then these are second graders. Their parents would drop the children off at the door and wouldn't come in. And the little second graders were taking off the boots. This is wintertime. This is snowy. The boots and everything by themselves. I'm saying to myself, I'll never get started teaching if I got to take all this stuff for all these kids. So parents, after like the first 2 days, I'm like, no, this is not going to happen. So I would tell the parents to come in Spanish. I said, come in, vente, to come in. And so the parents were like surprised that I'm telling them to come into the classroom. I mean, actually stepping over the threshold in the classroom. They never stepped foot over the threshold. I didn't know why they didn't do that. So when I welcomed them to come in to help them with their children to take their things off and put them in their little cubbies, they were surprised. So they did that. So that was a start of something. And then, of course, at the end of the day, I had been like for the first couple of days, I'm helping the children put their coats on and their boots on, the glasses and scarves on, the hats on. I was exhausted. And I would have to start like 20 minutes before the end of the day so that they wouldn't be late leaving. So I'm spending 20 minutes I could have done some more teaching time, helping these children to be prepared to go home and with their outer garments. And after I said to the parents, and they came to pick the children up, I just said, no, come in. I told them to come in and help me put the stuff on their kids and take them home. And then at that point, it was like, no problem. They came in every morning. They took the stuff off their children. They greeted me and they kissed their child and they left. I taught that class for, like I said, pretty much 2 months. And also there was an opportunity there with this, it was, I guess we call them, what do you call those? I can't remember. Anyway, the auditorium, they were having a holiday or Christmas event in the auditorium for the grades. So this class had to do something for the program. And the teacher who I was subbing for had given me all the materials and told me what they were doing. So we would practice. But I decided that wait a minute, I looked at the students in my class, I looked at other students in the community who were in the school. I said, we're going to convert this to bilingual presentation. So I was able to take a little bit of my Spanish and then a little help of one of the students to develop a bilingual exercise presentation for this class. And of course, for those who know me, you know me, I don't play. I go all out, and I did. I went all out, and it was a really big hit. I was very pleased. The children did well. They were enthusiastic. I had the Spanish speaking. I had the English speaking. We all spoke different language. Both English speaking and Spanish speaking students spoke in English and in Spanish. That was something that was important. They learned the words, and it was just letters and stuff they had to say. But it really, really went well. And I loved it, but that's just something I love to do. So that was excellent. It went well. Let me tell you what happened. After that, maybe a week or so, maybe it was a week. Oh, maybe it was a week later. I don't know. When anyway, it was before I left. It was before I left. So the play must have taken place before the last week of classes. So shortly after the play was presented and we were all finished with auditorium stuff, I got a call. Well, the vice president was it? No, vice principal, or I think it was assistant principal. They called it back then. The assistant principal approached me and said that the principal wanted to speak to me. I'm thinking, what did I do now, right? Because you think you don't go to the principal's office or anything. And I never had really interaction per se with the principal. So I said, okay. So I went to visit the principal, not knowing what entailed, the conversation entailed. And so I went to the office, and the principal was kind of nervous a little bit speaking with me. And he said, oh, Miss Kennedy, you're doing a great job, and you're doing a wonderful job. And I'm like, okay, thank you. And then he said, well, we'd like to offer you a position at the school, and you can't have this class, but we offer you another position in our bilingual program for this in January. And I said to him, oh, thank you for the offer. Yeah, but unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to take on a long-term position because I'm working on my, and my dissertation, and I need the time. So I'm not going to be able to commit to be a full-time sub for the rest of the school year in January to June. And then he thanked me, and he was like very nervous, and he was thanked me. So, oh, well, okay, well, thank you, Belinda, but we'd like you to still come and stuff when you can. I said, yes, I definitely would do that. So I left the principal's office, and I went back and I spoke to the assistant principal. I said, well, what was that about? And she shared with me, and listen carefully here. She shared with me the fact that the Spanish-speaking parents went en masse to the principal to say to the principal, we want this teacher to stay. We want to keep this teacher. We want this teacher for our children. And I don't know what else they said, but that's what she said to me, that the parents went en masse and in a group. The Spanish-speaking parents went in a group, 5, 6, whatever it was, how many it was, went to the principal and said, we want her to stay. We don't want her to leave. We want her to keep her in the school. We want her to stay with this class. Of course, I couldn't keep the class because the regular teacher was coming back. And it was just amazing. But I'm telling you this because you need to know, when you have a teacher who understands and implements the needs of what the children need, to include the cultural aspects. You invest in the parents. The relationship with parents is so important. And I believe that was a confirmation to me that parents, regardless of what country they come from, regardless of what language they speak, or what the economic wherewithal is, they all want the best for their children, point blank. So that was a confirmation for me at that stage. So later on in my career, of course, I did a research project on parents' perception of early childhood care. So you can look that up as well. Maybe I think it's on my website. So if you're interested, go to my website, www.silkstockingsisters.com, and check out that research article about parents' perception of early childhood care. So having said that, that's just about all I want to share with you today, but it's saying to you the importance of parents' involvement in early childhood education is significant. Parents' roles are significant in any capacity, even if they don't have the education, if even don't speak the language, even if they're new to the system, they still want the best for their children. And my experience confirms that. So I'm sharing that with you. For those of you who don't know that, will know now that involve parents in every aspect you can, because if you do, it'll make a better society for all of us, because those children eventually grow up and become adults. All right, that's it for today. Thank you for coming and listening to another episode of the Still Stock Consensus podcast. And we'll see you next time. And hopefully, it'll be another interesting topic. Bye now.